Welcome to this video about the extraordinary aloneness of Russian women in the 20th century and the traumatic consequences of that for women who are alive today, even for women who are young today, and even for women who haven't been born today. Why am I thinking about this now when I want to chat with you? Because a story came out that I'll relate to you, and I'll attach the link below this video, but I'd recommend you not to go there if you don't want to expose yourself to stuff that you don't need to hear. It's a tape of a conversation between a Russian soldier in Ukraine who was fighting and then got injured but survived, was in the hospital. Conversation with his wife, and they've got a 4-year-old. And she gives him explicit permission to engage in sexual violence against Ukrainian women, so long as he uses condoms. What the hell is going on there? Now, I don't want to comment on this directly, because there's nothing to say directly that you're not already realizing. And instead, I want to take it sideways into a conversation about extraordinary liberties that Russian women give Russian men. And straight away, if you've seen me talk, if we've talked before a few times, you know that this qualification is necessary, but in case this is your second or third video, I'll make it. When I talk about cultures, I'm typically talking about tendencies, not what's true of everybody in the culture. So if I say the French are so-and-so, what I'm actually saying isn't that every single French person is like that. It's rather that the total sort of cumulative effect of being immersed in French culture is more likely to guide you there than there. And that means that while 45% of Spaniards might have the tendency to go in some kind of direction, it might be 60% of French folks do. And that's what leads me to say the French are like that and the Spaniards are not. That's all. So we're just talking about tendencies here. We're not including people. And every time you make a cultural generalization, you often find that in that very culture you can come across the most extraordinary counterexamples and exceptions. And I didn't need to say that, but I just did. And so that's all I'm doing by talking about Russia in the way I'm about to chat with you. But it's undoubtedly true that there's something to this. Let's take another story that's even more extreme than this story has come out, than the story that's come out in the last couple of days. And that's the story of a Russian woman who killed her baby a few years ago. And the baby was physically abused by this woman's male partner. And this male partner didn't like being kept awake by the baby, and the woman, the mum, killed her baby. And in an interview said that he was making her man unhappy. And then I think when asked, what the hell are you talking about? She said, well, he at least he was mine. He might have not liked my kid, but at least he was mine, and so I killed my kid. Now, that's an extreme story. But again, we're talking tendencies. And if it's a couple of needles in a haystack story, in another culture, that story will be one needle in many haystacks. So there is a difference. So what the hell is up? Now, there are disproportionately more women than men in Russia compared with the typical statistics for most countries. That's not, in fact, a product of the Soviet period, because there were already there was a 55-45 gap, I think, in the Tsarist period at the end of the 19th century. But for periods of Soviet communism, amongst some generations, that pattern got exacerbated. But we're not just talking about numbers here. What we're talking about is also the disappearance of men who weren't killed in the Soviet period. So we're talking about the men who were killed in the war. We're talking about the men who were killed in both wars. We're talking about the men who were in the GULAG, and the GULAG had a 90% annual survival rate. And even though the most appalling stories I know from the GULAG are stories of women in the GULAG, men made up, I think, 85% plus of the GULAG population. And during the Stalin period, the GULAG population was, I think, up to 5 million at any given point, from the mid-30s till 53 at least, when Stalin died. So lots of men are killed, particularly in the Second World War, but then lots of men are just gone, and women are alone, and they have to compensate, run their children's lives without the dad being there, and then the dad comes back very often in no shape to be any kind of a dad. So this is one layer. Men who are not just killed, but then men who are gone. And then there's another very important layer. And that's that the best men were killed and taken away. The most thinking, the most outward-looking men were the men who were taken by the Soviet repressions. We lost the battery, but we're back. So what have we got? We've got a situation where men are taken away, men are killed, and then the best men are taken away. The best men are killed. So there is a systemic negative selection across generations in Russia. That's selecting against the best quality men. What are the consequences of all of this? I think there is a couple of consequences at least worth mentioning for women. One is that many Soviet women had to carry everything alone. They had to be the breadwinner and had to carry all of the parenting. And combining the two was often a brutal thing in the Soviet Union, and a brutalizing thing. Sometimes other generations helped, the kids' grandparents, but the women had to carry the whole damn show alone. And you can feel the consequence of this. You can feel the intergenerational trauma of this, even in 16-year-old girls in Russia. It's passed on. Girls who will never experience the actual situation of men being confiscated by the regime. And I think that one other consequence worth mentioning is that low-quality men became prized by higher quality women. And a lot of women gave great liberties to their men. And of course, Russia is a very gendered culture, where the prejudice that we have in the West against women, where it's easier to be heard if you're a man, and we can just carry on this conversation for many hours, all of that is magnified 15x in Russia. But you've got a situation where that line from that awful story we mentioned a few minutes ago of at least I had one, at least this one was mine, has some cultural substance to it. So I'm not saying that what I've just told you explains the first story we mentioned about the young wife encouraging her young husband to engage in sexual violence. But I'm saying that a fraction of that story is explained by what I've shared. That in another culture, many things would block that kind of conversation from being psychologically available. And one of the blocks, just one, is what we discussed. In other words, I have a 4-year-old here. What's the impact on the 4-year-old of their father going around and engaging in ethically and legally egregious behavior like that? And so perhaps here is the third consequence of this whole 20th century story. And that's that Russian women disproportionately weigh in favor of partners over children. I think that children are more important to Russian women than their partners. So I don't want to overstate this. But compared with the degree of importance children have, certainly for us in the West, vis-a-vis the importance of partners, that balance is different and it's weighed against the children in Russia. I mean, in the West, this is very, very basic stuff. I mean, look, in my past life, I have had a couple of relationships with women with children. And when that's a serious relationship, even as the non-biological parent in that dynamic, the welfare of the kids is more important than the relationship. I mean, if I'm with you and you're a woman and you have children, your children are more important than our relationship. And if there's any kind of conflict between the two, your children come first, not just for you, but for me, obviously. And, you know, in that kind of situation, the non-biological partner in the West would be, in many cases, and certainly that's my feeling, readier to die for the partner's kids than for the partner, although ready for the partner too. That balance is different in Russia. It's different. And you might say, then, what is this about? Is this cultural difference in the sense that different cultures do things different ways? Or is this trauma? And I think that it's trauma for two reasons. One is that there's a kind of sacredness of bond between mum and child that has something universal to it. There is a psychology that comes out of biology there, and the sacredness of that bond between the mum and the child in many ways transcends cultural difference, even though there are cultures that via very complex variations get around this, but basically biology takes us there. And so I don't think Russians are doing something different. They are via trauma negating a natural human disposition. And if you take away the trauma, this thing would fix. And I'm aware, not just anthropologically, but personally, of different cultures. I mean, I got thankfully for a very brief period of time, because we worked it out, I got given a baby in Tonga when I was living in Tonga many years ago. And in Tonga, it's not atypical for children to be brought up by a network of people, and very often the lead folks in the parent role aren't the parents. They might be cousins, aunts, uncles, whoever. And the kids get passed around. And the kid that I got was given to a young woman in church who praised the kid for being beautiful. And I mean, we're talking like a 6-month-old. Praised the kid for being beautiful, and got it, but didn't want it, and gave it to me. And eventually, what happened is that young woman kept the child, and the parents didn't want it, didn't take it. But there's a very complex cultural story about how this works, and we'd need to go there, we'd need to talk about it, and that's possible, and that happens, and humans live under culture, and culture cuts deeper than most people assume, etc., etc., etc. But without piecing it all together, because then we're going to have a much longer conversation, that's not the story in Russia. The story in Russia basically is that there's this unhealthy tilt that requires not a anthropological but psychopathological explanation. So that's a little bit of a share on this. I hope this brought some value. I'll be there in the comments to answer any reactions. Lots of love. See you tomorrow on the main channel. Bye bye.